And from Barnard College. We're very grateful for everyone who's joined us today, where we're going to be talking about understanding Russia's influence in the Middle East after Assad's fall. And I'm super, super grateful for our panelists for taking the time to talk to us today. I wanted to just give everybody a little bit of overview logistics, which is that the way that these seminar series worked is that we invite each of our panelists to give some opening remarks. We're using the webinar format, as you know, at this point from Zoom, and so you can ask questions at any time. Alex and I will choose questions from the Q&A as well as our own questions to pose to the panelists after their opening remarks. We're not going to introduce the panelists all at the beginning. Alex will do some brief introductions of them in turn. We'll also put some information in the chat of the webinar where you can learn more about the panelists. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can ask questions in the chat on YouTube as well, and we'll keep an eye on those as well. I also, just before passing it over to Alex to introduce our panelists, I just want to, address the elephant in the room, which is that, we have to plan these events a little bit ahead of time. All eyes are on Ukraine right now, and the ongoing evolution of U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine. But one of the things that I think part of our responsibility in academia is to make sure that we don't lose sight of other things because of all the balls that are in the air, and only pay attention to the most recent of those balls to be thrown in a way that is affecting everybody. And so while yes, our thoughts are all in what is going on in Ukraine, and everybody has one eye looking on what's happening there, it is important to remember that there are things happening in the rest of the world, and there are major developments that major developments that don't affect the new U.S. presidential administration. One of which was the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and the Middle East has been long an area of interest to Russia, of interest to other powers. And so we're very grateful to our panelists here today to take time to make sure that we do keep our eyes on things that are happening all over the world. Don't get too distracted by what is, a shock and awe campaign coming out of Washington these days about so many things happening all the time. So we know we know this is happening, but we think it's also very important that we continue to talk about topics that are of great importance and that will continue to be of great importance, even as we see all these kind of developments happening in a fast time. So with that being said, it's my great pleasure to welcome, and also just to say again, to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who's been our longtime supporter of this New York City Russia public policy series. We've been at this for 7, 8, 9 years, a long time now at this point, and we're incredibly grateful to Carnegie for making these events possible. So with that, I'll pass it over to Alex, who will introduce you to the speakers. And once again, thank our speakers and thank all of you for joining us here today.
Yeah, Josh, thank you so much for that. And thank you, audience over Zoom and YouTube. And thank you to our 3 really distinguished speakers who are very much in the public sphere regarding these issues, both within the Middle East and certain subtopics within the Middle East. The only thing I'll say to sort of echo what Josh said is we tend to think of parts of the world as sort of segregated into different kinds of regions, each within their own dynamics. Maybe that was the case at some point, maybe not, but increasingly what you're seeing is the kind of interflow between these regions, right? So it's no accident that we had U.S.-Russia talks hosted by Saudi Arabia, right? That we've seen Gulf countries sort of mediate issues in the Ukraine war itself. And so while Ukraine is obviously not the current topic, certainly we have the interaction between these kinds of emerging powers and regions that perhaps wasn't the case before. So each of our speakers is going to speak about 10 to 12 minutes, and we are going to proceed as follows. First up is Sam Ramani, who's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a think tank in London, and the CEO of Pangea Geopolitical Risk. Sam is a longtime commentator on Russia in the Middle East, Russia in Africa, and geopolitical risk. So Sam, we'll turn it over to you for some scene setting on what the fall of Assad means for Russia, its Middle East policy, and the region as a whole. Welcome.
Sure. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Thanks, Josh and Alex, for putting this excellent panel together and this very interesting discussion. What I would say, just to start things off, is that obviously the Russian loss in Syria and the potential loss of the bases in Tartus and Khmeimim really were a shock to the system for the Russians. I mean, you were seeing some commentaries coming through, for example, from Fyodor Lukyanov in Russian International Affairs Council, basically arguing that this is a moment to recognize that countries of Russia's economic size, Russia's GDP, no longer have the ability to engage in global power projection. Instead of engaging in high risk, potentially low return initiatives in the global south, we should really be focusing on looking inward and focusing on saving our weakening foothold in the post Soviet space. And that's obviously a reference to some of the zigzagging that we've seen Kazakh President Tokayev have over the Ukraine war, some of the issues with regards to Armenia drifting towards the West. And this was even before the Azerbaijan plane crash and the strains that we've been seeing in that increasingly important relationship. And Lukyanov was by no means the only person to be thinking about this. There was another interesting article in Russian Global Affairs, actually an interview with Lukyanov and Nikolai Sukhov that I found quite interesting, where basically Sukhov was talking about how could the Russians have missed this? How could the Russians have not seen that they were going to be weakened in Syria and that their foothold was going to be unraveling? There was the Caesar Act sanction that was tankering the economy from 2020. The population in general was becoming more restive in areas like Idlib after 2018, and I really couldn't settle that. Then there was the collapse of the Lebanese financial system, and then there was the Israeli attacks on Lebanon as a result of the Gaza war, and then finally, which he didn't talk so much about, but obviously was relevant, was the HTS military buildup that we saw in the years leading up to 2024, including the strike in 2022 that killed about 100 military commanders. So it was very clear that they would be able to make their own drones, their own long-range missiles, and the Russians at that time were not dealing with that threat. They kind of felt that there was this illusion of authoritarian stability in Syria, and they chose to open up 9 new observation posts in the Golan Heights, fearing Israeli revanchism much more than Syrian unrest in the weeks leading up to Assad's fall. And they were completely caught off guard by what was happening. And I got that sense too when I was engaging with a Russian delegation myself in the Doha Forum in the day before Assad fell. Sergei Lavrov was there. I attended his speech. Lavrov was trying to put on a very brave face, but also with an unusual degree of, sardonic pessimism, even because he was talking about basically how well I'm not a prognosticator. I can't predict the future. We're doing all we can, and then of course everything fell apart. So there was a clear crisis of confidence. There was a clear question about why we missed this, and a clear reassessment of what Russian capabilities were. But my big caution that I put out in some of my commentaries, as well as in an article for Foreign Policy a few weeks later, was that we shouldn't be paying so much attention just to the physical impacts of the loss of Assad. So the loss of geopolitical foothold in the Middle East or the loss of the bases. Much worse than the loss of the bases was the loss of Russia's standing or perceived standing as an alternative great power, and what that might mean to perceptions of Russia as an alternative leader within a multipolar world order, and also perceptions of Russia's standing in world affairs. I think this was a much more damaging prestige blow and status blow than even a geopolitical and logistics blow. And that is true from a number of different standpoints. When you actually look at, for example, where Russian soft power was kind of situated before the collapse of Assad in Syria, obviously the Arab world was almost entirely at one point against the Russian military intervention in Syria. You had Oman, obviously, was the only Arab country that, in the Gulf at least, that kept normal relations with Assad. The UAE gave it a qualified endorsement in 2015, but the Saudis and the Qataris and most others were against it. Egypt zigzagged on the question for ultimately settling in a pro-Assad direction. So my point is that not many people really liked what Russia was doing in terms of propping up Assad, in terms of giving Iran such a pronounced foothold in the Middle East. But they did like certain aspects of it. They liked the image of loyalty to an ally in crisis that seemed to contrast with the United States abandoning Mubarak or abandoning Suharto in the past or abandoning other dictators when supporting them became inconvenient. They admired the degree to which Russia was able to use air power and relatively low cost to human lives to achieve outsized impacts. Like if you look at the Wilson Center Arab Youth surveys from 2018 to 2020, even those in the Gulf countries that were opposed to Assad acknowledged that Russia's military intervention in Syria was the most decisive display of force by any external power in the region since the U.S. Won the 1991 Gulf War and kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So there was this perception of Russian decisiveness, Russian loyalty, and that gave them a degree of soft power, a degree of status. And that was something that was quite firmly shattered by the way in which Russia and Iran basically did very little except for bombing some civilian targets in the final days in support of Assad. And that's something that's not just affecting their influence in the Middle East, it's also profoundly affecting their influence in Africa too. That's why I think you're probably seeing Faustin Augustin Touadera, the president of Central African Republic, visiting Moscow in January. And even though the Russians typically tend to rotate troops out of CAR during on climactic grounds during this time of the year, the Russians offering significantly more things, rumors on Telegram about a Russian base being constructed there, which was something that was broached at the Sochi summit about 6 years ago, but seemed to have died out ever since then. And then the recent allegations that you probably may have seen where Britain was accusing Russia of interfering in their elections. The point is to set off clients, not just in the Middle East, but also inside Africa, including the most captured of clients like CAR, could be kind of looking at Russia with second thoughts. So this prestige and status blow was a big blow to them inside the global south more broadly. And it was interesting to see some of the most ardent pro-war Telegram channels, which sometimes would criticize the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, now also talking about how potentially our foothold in Africa is dead. I think Boris Rogin and Colonel Kassad was one of the most interesting ones where he was saying, like, where are we in Africa? I don't think we can do anything here. So that's that loss of prestige is one thing that I wanted to really emphasize. In terms of the how long that might last, I'm skeptical that it might not last as long as we might think. And there's several reasons why I think Russia could rebuild some of that prestige and some of that soft power down the line, even if its perception as a military power has declined. The first is the Russians have managed to be able to spin their information warfare in the Middle East quite brilliant, quite effectively, and almost on an industrial scale. RT Arabic was the most popular channel amongst amongst Arab audiences between ages of 18 to 35, mostly circulating on YouTube in many Middle Eastern countries, often superseding both Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. And they were able to effectively promote narratives about Russia's conduct in unlikely places. In the past, it was about Libya, where they were basically arguing that Khalifa Haftar was fighting terrorism. And also, they were very effective in pushing narratives during the Ukraine war about the fact that this was a proxy war between NATO and Russia, the fact that this was the Ukrainian mining of ports, which was in self-defense against a Russian attack in Odessa, was the reason for food insecurity, not Russia targeting Black Sea port infrastructure and trying to blockade the coast, things like this. The Russian narratives have outsized appeal and enduring appeal, and that's also powered by long-term state media partnerships between Russia and different Arab countries. I think you should pay attention to some of the partnerships between Sputnik and Al-Aram, or some of the Russian media investments in Saudi Arabia, or the expansion of Tunisia as a foothold for power projection across the francophone western half of Africa. Russia views its media and information outlets as strategically vital industries, viewed it ever since the 2008 Georgian War, and perhaps even earlier than that. And just because they're being cut out of Europe, the resources are being beefed up very heavily here. That information machinery is alive and well and is being actively promoted by surrogates on the ground. It's really interesting when you engage or when I track, for example, Emirati media outlets and how they cover it in the Arabic language, even Sky News Arabia, which is more globalized, to the Arabic language, how they cover the Russia-Ukraine conflict. You very commonly see Russian guests coming on talking about how 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died, which is the common number that the Russians were using last year. And the Russians are killing 8 Ukrainians for every one, and things like this being presented without criticism. So the point is, Russia still got the information power to be able to counteract the loss of stature. The second thing was the Gaza war and the U.S. response to it, especially if Donald Trump doubles down on supporting Israel once this current ceasefire in Gaza comes to an end, was quite detrimental to U.S. influence. It was a boon for Russian soft power in the region, and also caused many people to associate Vladimir Zelensky and his support of Israel with the unpopularity of U.S. policy. So it's pretty interesting that in places like Tunisia and places like Turkey, 60 to 70% of people have a negative view of Zelensky. And that in turn leads to some more receptiveness to Russian narratives and to accepting or sympathizing with Russia's self-defense narratives and Russia's arguments inside Ukraine. The third thing is that the opening of the dialogue between the United States and Russia, and the fact that the Russians are really vaunting and promoting the fact that this is being held in Saudi Arabia, which is kind of a symbol of multipolarity in the new order, is something that also gives Russia a shot in the arm, because it basically, number one, reinforces the notion that Russia is supporting a multipolar world order, which is something that it really wants to frame itself as. And also, it will lead to an easing of pressure on countries in the Middle East to comply with secondary sanctions or to refrain from the joint investments with Russia. I mean, already there was that tendency. Just take a look at the UAE, for example. You saw the Mubadala and the Russian Direct Investment Fund create strong ties in 2013, strengthen them in 2020, further develop them in the years that followed. And aside from a few cosmetic compromises on particularly OFAC designated entities that were laundering gold, but even that was just more in rhetoric than in practice. And also the temporary closure of transactions via Mashreq Bank, the UAE remained a resilient foothold for Russian dual-use goods to enter Russia and for Russia to violate sanctions across the globe. And it was pretty telling that one of the Dubai trade chiefs basically said in May of 2024 is that why should we think about sanctions? Sanctions are basically completely worthless and ineffective in this case. So the easing of secondary sanctions pressure will just simply and the notion that Russia is kind of furthering a degree of multipolarity by encouraging these negotiations in Saudi Arabia will probably give Russia more opportunities, especially in the post-war setting. So I think that basically my argument is that Syria was a shot in the arm to Russian prestige and status, but Trump and what's happening in Ukraine may actually be an unexpected corrector to something that could have lasted a lot longer. Finally, looking at more of the geopolitical impacts and what we might be seeing going forward across the region. I mean, obviously, the Russians took a surprisingly pragmatic tone, I think, to the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government. I mean, I think that the overall view, even in Lavrov's speech at the Doha Forum, like 12 hours before Assad fell, was that these people were terrorists who we can't possibly negotiate with. Somebody asked him a question. The Taliban basically were also terrorists, and we dealt with them after 2021. Maybe you can come to a compromise, and he kind of skirted it. But they have been, even from the day after, sending diplomats to meet with the new Syrian government, and you've seen outrages from people like Bogdanov and other usual suspects with them, and the Syrian Defense Ministry leaving the door open to the Russians eventually maybe getting back their bases, provided that they pay reparations of some kind and they kind of admit to culpability. Obviously, the Russians were gambling on in Syria the fact that the U.S. and Western sanctions would remain very tight. The automatic renewal of the Caesar Act sanctions to 2029 by the Congress kind of suggested that, as well as some of the early statements coming from France and Germany and other European countries about the lack of pluralism in HTS, and the French taking a strong degree of support for the Kurds, as well as the Israelis supporting the Kurds, which influences the Americans and other Westerners to kind of be more critical of the HTS government. But if the sanctions are moving towards incremental easing, as we've seen with Britain, and now we're starting to see with the EU and on some development assistance areas with the United States, then I think that it's going to be harder for Russia to maintain its bases and its pull and its foothold in Syria. But they're doing the best they can, and they're hoping that a combination of slow sanctions relief, lack of investment, continued Israeli revanchism in the Golan Heights and beyond, tolerated and supported by the West, as well as the desire for Syria to kind of hedge its bets in terms of a multipolar order, will give Russia a seat at the table going forward. It's notable that HTS's rhetoric has been consistently more open towards re-engaging with Russia in spite of its atrocities in Syria compared to Iran, where they, even in one interview, Ahmed al-Shara had different rhetoric on Russia and Iran early on after the war ended and Assad fell and he took over. The other place where I think geopolitically we should be really watching for resurgence of Russian power, and we should be paying a lot of attention to, is Libya. And really, actually even before the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the Russians were trying to expand their presence in Libya. Right, just hours before Yevgeny Prigozhin went on his fatal plane crash, the Russian Ministry of Defense made their first official counterterrorism agreement with Khalifa Haftar's government. Khalifa Haftar's representatives had just visited the Moscow Security Conference, and then you saw Russian Defense Ministry delegates touch down and express support for their common understanding on counterterrorism. The Russians then gave aid to the flood-hit areas of Derna, even though obviously those floods were partially exacerbated by Haftar's restrictive humanitarian aid policies and unwillingness to put observers and other aid personnel on the ground. The Russians gave aid there in a symbolic way to kind of show the solidarity, and that strengthened things. Yunusbek Kurov has been shuttling back and forth between Moscow and Benghazi on a quite regular basis to enhance their capabilities. They started expanding their bases even since the middle of last year, according to some reports. that I was seeing and some interviews I had with Libyans and Russians working on this. And also, we saw some real movements in the aftermath of Assad's fall. We saw an AN 124 jet moving between Khmeimim and Al Jufra, the base over there, the movement of S-300s and S-400s there, and clear discussions about Libya potentially being a potential alternative hub and a refueling hub for forces in Mali and Burkina Faso, which is quite notable too. And obviously, Tobruk cannot really match the depth of size that a renovated Tartus could have, and the aerial capabilities that you see in Jufra are more limited than what you could see in Khmeimim. But they still have access to NATO's southern flank and a foothold in the Mediterranean, and they still have a logistical pathway to the Sahel, albeit at a higher financial cost. So it's just they can still project power with Libya, but it's just more costly and it's just a bit more inconvenient, and it means more trips and fewer fewer planes and fewer arms shipments moving each and every single time. So that's kind of what the question is. Now, the question is not that, we're going to be cut off logistically. The question is managing the costs and managing the delivery and the distribution. So that's kind of just one thing we should watch, a greater expansion of Russian involvement in Libya, especially the new Trump administration seems to be really disengaged from the conflict, mirroring his approach during his first term. So far, there hasn't really been even a single statement about it, or really or any meaningful gestures towards dealing with that issue. And just one last thing, as I know I'm conscious of time, I think that the Russians still have got the ability to build partnerships with fellow authoritarian regimes in the region, especially I think with the Egyptians, with the Emiratis, and with some others, on some of their aversions to pluralism, aversions to popular revolutions, political Islam. Some of the things, those partnerships were built during the Arab Spring era, and those things will continue as unrest might follow the end of the Gaza war and some of the changes that we're seeing in the regional system. Regional system changes often lead to civil unrest. And in those civil unrest moments, Russia will be siding with the autocrats and will have an autocratic coterie of allies to rely upon going forward.
Great. Sam, thank you. You have put a lot on the table there, and we really appreciate it. A lot of angles here, and also not as covered sort of issues there. So we're grateful. Our next speaker is Nicole Grawiewski, who is a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, expert commentator specifically on Russia-Iran issues, as well as other kinds of multipolar issues, and a forthcoming book, I believe, on Russia-Iran. And certainly lots of analysis of how this really intriguing, pragmatic relationship has been evolving. So, Nicole, welcome back to Harriman and to the Jordan Center. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So, I mean, I kind of want to contextualize the Russia-Iran relationship, not only within Syria, but also how it transcended to Ukraine. Because I think these two conflicts were inextricably tied together, and the Russia-Iran relationship is a pretty good example of that. I mean, Syria is where the Russia-Iran relationship really bore fruit. You see the foundation of institutional partnerships between the militaries. You see Iranian ground forces working in conjunction with the Russian aerospace force, Hezbollah working with the aerospace force as well. And so this level of interoperability that was formed in Syria, in 2015 when the Russians intervened, I mean, that transcended to other parts of the Russia-Iran relationship, but also to what we eventually saw as Iranian providing drones to Russia for its war in Ukraine. One thing that was, I think, quite remarkable about this was that that relationship was pretty much formed overnight. In a matter of a few months, the Russians and the Iranians worked together to coordinate a joint campaign, eventually, which retook the majority of Syrian territory that held, obviously, until late November last year. But what was also clear was that there was tensions in this relationship, and there's historically been tensions in the Russia-Iran relationship, and Syria was where you really saw this. Russia would at times turn a blind eye to Israeli strikes against Iranian-backed forces. But this kind of changed eventually around 2018, 2017, where the Russia-Iran relationship expanded beyond Syria. And so these networks were much more crucial to areas like regime stability and regime security, where you see Russia and Iran cooperating much more closely in areas that have to do with domestic repression, information security, but also with sanctions evasion, especially after the CAATSA sanctions that were imposed on Russia. I think the war in Ukraine really shifted this, and it impacted the extent of Russia-Iran cooperation, not only in Syria, but beyond. I mean, after Ukraine, you saw the kind of drawdown of Russian forces, which meant there was a heavier reliance on Iranian-backed forces in the country. And this seemed largely sustainable until the Wagner rebellion, which kind of led to the reduction of the Wagner forces in Syria and Iran's control over these areas. And Russia gave Iran far more leeway than they had previously. And that was really crucial when we think about what actually happened when Assad fell. It's that there was essentially Iranian-backed forces that Russia became so reliant on. But then once October 7th occurred, and you see the outbreak of October 7th, that these forces actually became degraded. And so the very forces that Russia became so dependent on and that Assad became so dependent on essentially evaporated overnight, or had this kind of virtual land blockade on them since December of 2023. And that actually became really quite crucial. I mean, the Russians assumed, and I think this is what the Iranians assumed as well, is that they could vie for influence in Syria and kind of carve out their own spheres of influence in the country. And that was very clear over military reform. The Russians wanted to create certain aspects of the Syrian military that were beholden to Russia, whereas Iran was much more focused on proxy forces or kind of local elites or local alliances. But that ultimately proved to be quite hollow, and the Syrian state proved to be so dependent on its external actors that when you see both the drawdown of Russian forces, but also the degradation of Iranian-backed forces because of October 7th and the Israel-Gaza war, that this just created a situation where neither had the capability nor the will really to support Assad. I mean, there's quite a bit of debate about whether or not Russia and Iran could have launched a counteroffensive. I think that could have been feasible, but it seemed like there was also a conscious political decision, especially in Tehran, that, Assad was already gone. I mean, I think that by December 2nd, it was clear that for both the Russians and the Iranians that the Syrian Arab Army was not sustainable and that they had to cut their losses. And you saw that actually with the Russian outreach to HTS and to other opposition forces, which the Russians had been involved in through other track twos historically. But one thing that I think that kind of encapsulates how this, the Syria and the Ukraine side of it is connected is like you would see Iranian drone instructors training Russian operatives in Syria at like Sherat Air Base, for example. Eventually, this was obviously overtaken by HTS. But then also the Ukrainians expanded their cooperation and provided FPV to FPVs to the HTS in Idlib. So there was this interconnection and this kind of horizontal escalation that you also saw with Russian engagement to what, the so-called axis of resistance, especially after October 7th, where Iran was facilitating Russian cooperation with the Houthis, or at least encouraging cooperation between Russia and Hezbollah. And so the relationship kind of proliferated and expanded in that sense. And so one thing that I think, I took away from this whole kind of fall of Assad, but was that, I mean, the Russia-Iran relationship was formed in Syria. It kind of transcended Syria. And even if they kind of lost Assad or they lost that influence, in the process, they gained each other and they gained institutional ties that have endured. And I think that the recent 2025 strategic partnership agreement shows that. I mean, there was no mutual defense agreement, and this was a long time in the process, but a lot of the clauses and implicit areas of cooperation would have been unforeseeable, 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. And you see Russia committing to a level of intelligence cooperation with Iran that would have been quite unprecedented in the past. You see Russia and Iran committing to joint military exercises and the continuation of that, cooperation in space and other sensitive areas. So this relationship that, bore fruit in Syria is much more robust than it was before. I mean, that being said, there's a lot of changes, I think, because of the Trump administration. And I think in both Moscow and Tehran right now, there are debates about whether one or the other is going to sell them out to the United States. But I think if you look internally in both countries, the kind of corridors of power have somewhat of a vested interest in expanding this cooperation, especially on the Iranian side. I mean, Iran, you frequently hear distrust about the Russians. Even after Assad fell, some IRGC generals were blaming the Russians for not having an effective air campaign. But the real kind of, within the leadership of Iran, I think they see the value of cooperation with Russia, whether that's over sensitive technologies like space launch vehicles, or also over tactics of sharing domestic repression techniques. I mean, this relationship is much more layered than it was before. And now there's this dependence on Iran for the Russians. And whether or not that continues with the war in Ukraine, I mean, that's to be seen. Still, this is somewhat unprecedented to see that Russia has, looked to Iran for military aid or for military support and for support actually on sanctions evasion. So the sharing of practices and the sharing of kind of strategies of resistance, we wouldn't have seen that if they hadn't had that cooperation in Syria. And so I think my kind of ending remarks is pretty much that, this is something that went beyond the Middle East, and it shows how interconnected these two wars actually became. And it's likely going to continue, though. I think it's inevitable that there'll be tensions in this relationship. There's always going to be tensions in the Russia-Iran relationship, but as long as both are isolated or somewhat isolated and in this kind of siege mentality, the relationship on both sides becomes incredibly much more lucrative and valuable for both. So.
Nicole, thanks so much. And again, thanks again for pointing those, really interesting interconnections and the process by which these ties and sort of, pragmatic modes of operational cooperation are built up. Absolutely fascinating. Our next panelist is Dimitar Bechev, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and he's going to address, amongst other things, topic of Russia-Turkey ties, going forward. Welcome, Dimitar.
Thank you, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. I'm fascinated listening to Simon and Nicole, with whom we share a lot of background, fellow Oxford products. Before I get to Turkey, I want to make a few general points about the Middle East and Russia, if you allow me. And since you referenced academia, one of the luxuries of academia is taking the longer view rather than just chasing the headlines. And number one is that if you compare Russia's presence after the Syrian intervention to historical precedent, you will easily arrive at the conclusion that it was a very thin form of presence. Go back to the 1950s, 1960s, the height of Soviet involvement in the Middle East. You see a different level of commitment, density of connections, and resources that the Soviet leadership would bring to bear in places like Egypt, but also Iraq and Syria, all those friendly regimes that were aligned, but also in a way copied the Soviet model of development. And no surprise, after the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the issues in bilateral relations was how to cope with the debt that had accumulated as a result of all those failed policies of support. Fast forward to the present, what Russia did was inserting itself in this region in the pursuit of status and also to get America's attention. It was at that point that Obama at the UN General Assembly in 2015 actually had a face-to-face with Putin. He would before ignore the Russian leader. It was also some geopolitical leverage, access to markets. But I think the general point is that Russia never sought to be the linchpin of regional order because it entails responsibilities and risks as well. It just exploited the gaps that were out there. There was no point where Russia really was prepared to match the level of US commitment. Because for all the discussion around withdrawal from the Middle East, the numbers show a very different picture in the Gulf, but also elsewhere, the level of deployment and the capabilities and the density of political connections. Even under Obama and Trump won when the trend was towards disengagement. So Russia was not an alternative hegemon. It was very much an exploitative external force trying to step in. Number two, that was enabled by local actors, not just the Assad regime, but local regional powers. And very much, I agree with Nicole. It was an Iranian-Russian intervention. It was joint enterprise from day one, with Qasem Soleimani playing a crucial role. And Russia piggybacked on Iran, and there was also Iran could use Russian air power. And this matching worked over the years. The moment the regional balance changed, the equilibrium, that partly because of Gaza, but not only, Russia was wrong-footed. There was little it could do to prevent the local players setting scores. In fact, at the height of Russian influence, one of the advantages Russia had was having this equidistant relationship to all the main guys. It had a channel to the Iranians and relationship with Iran. It engaged the Gulf as well. Eventually, Turkey was also in Russia's camp. It could talk to the Palestinians and to the Israelis, to the Moroccans and the Algerians, not to forget the Maghreb, Algeria being one of the historically loyal customers of Russia, but also whatever the weather, you can bet on them remaining in Moscow's orbit. And that changed because of polarization. With Gaza, they had to take a stand as well, to the extent probably they preferred not to lose their middle position. But again, I think for me the headline is the moment sense shifted in the Middle East, Russia couldn't do much because it hadn't committed much in the first instance. Just an air base in Yemen and the security relationship with Assad didn't add up to the level of what they achieved politically. It was a good investment until it worked. Now going to Turkey, which of course is a critical player or critical piece of this puzzle. There are lots of things we can say. The number one, I suppose, is that initially the dynamic was favoring Russia because the moment Russia intervened in Syria, it thwarted Erdogan's plans to effect the regime change in Damascus. So that's what the Iranians and the Russians effectively did. Conditioning Turkey's behavior in multiple ways, through economic sanctions, through supporting the Kurdish militia, the YPG in the northeast, through sanctions, of course, through cutting Turkish companies' access to the Russian market in the construction sector, and so on and so forth. So there was a heavy cost inflicted on the Turks for this. For those of you who remember the downing of the Russian jet. And as a result, Turkey adjusted policy and started talking to the Russians, and they divided the spoils pretty much with the Astana process and deconfliction, reconciliation in all those areas. Eventually, the Russians gave green light to Turkey to intervene in the northwest initially, and then in the northeast, and it worked. But there was always a competitive element. And we saw it in 2020 with the offensive against Idlib, when Turkey managed to deal a few punches to the Russians, pretending it was the Syrian army, but it was really the Russian military, and bring Putin back to the table and negotiate a deal over the Idlib province, which going forward probably helped HTS build the system of governance, which they're trying to project at the national level now. But I think what's really important is that now with the downfall of the regime, tables have turned in a way because Turkey has the upper hand. Russia has been humbled. Its presence has been diminished. It's not a threat anymore. Russian forces had to withdraw from the Kurdish areas. Those joint patrols and connections they had to the Kurdish guerrillas are not there anymore. So the value of Russia is gone. Turkey obviously doesn't have to talk to Assad anymore. And that was something that Russia was really instrumental pretty much until the very last day, because Ankara wanted to engage with the regime. It was the regime that was playing hard to get and denying Erdogan a summit where they could talk about the issue of refugee returns, which is critical to Turkey's domestic stability. And I don't want to go into the weeds on this one. Maybe in the Q&A we have one opportunity. But now Russia is of no value to Turkey in the way that the US is, given the continued deployment in the Northeast. And Turkey can tolerate Russia's presence in the Latakia province. It doesn't pose any security risk. In fact, even Russia's probably interested in having Turkey's cooperation make continued presence possible. But it's not only about Syria. I mean, I very much agree with you, Alex, your opening remark about the region being a wider sort of complex and various regions merging one another. From Turkey's perspective, since the 90s, really, the nightmare scenario has been encircled by all those enemies, starting from Greece through Iran and Syria, all the way to Armenia and Russia. And Russia almost made it happen with deployments in Armenia beefed up in 2015 with Crimea's annexation. So Turkey was surrounded by Russia one way or the other 10 years ago. Now it's not the case anymore because of Karabakh falling to the Azeris and Armenia looking for peace. Ukraine stopping Russia from acquiring the entire littoral in the Black Sea. Turkey gaining upper hand in the Black Sea with the closure of the straits. So there's a wider geopolitics beyond the Middle East we have to factor in. So Turkey has the luxury of feeling a bit more confident vis-a-vis Russia than it has been the case in the past years. What does it mean going forward? I don't think Turkey will be arrogant and trying to dictate terms to the Russians and trying to overplay its hand right now. It will continue the same policy of engaging, of being the intermediary, talking to the Ukrainians as well. I mean, Zelensky was in Istanbul when Putin was in Riyadh, not to forget. And now, as of today, Lavrov was talking Ukraine in Ankara, trying to find a role for itself in what follows in Ukraine, maybe also in reconstruction. So the Russia piece is really important for Turks, and they'll be cautious, not trying to bask in their glory. We scored a big win against Russia in Syria. Let's try to squeeze even further the Russians. So I'll stop here and maybe get some questions and see how this conversation goes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dimitar. Thank you, all panelists. You know, I'm going to, inspired, I think, by your comments, I'm going to ask you what might seem sort of a provocative question with this kind of multipolar, interconnected world as the background. So it is the 3-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and apparently the U.S. Today voted against an affirmation of Ukrainian sovereignty, which is really extraordinary, and it shows how much the world might be changing. My question to the three of you is, you have all, I think, in some way talked about this interconnection between Ukraine and parts of the Middle East. And I'm wondering whether we could even go a bit further. Could you think about or comment about, I think this assumption has always been from a kind of Western point of view that the West is going to reach some sort of settlement in the peace negotiation over security guarantees to Ukraine, but that this is predominantly going to be about European security architecture and Russia and Ukraine's place in it. What we're seeing now with North Korean troops, Iranian cooperation, some of the ties and concerns that Dimitar has talked about, Sam's really wide scope of everything from Golan Heights to North Africa. Can we sort of flip this on its head and talk about the potential for Middle East or adjacent Middle East powers to themselves now start becoming players in European security? Is it too far-fetched to be able to sort of make that kind of analysis? And what might be some vectors that we would look out for? So, for instance, would it be crazy to think that Moscow might propose that Iranian troops be peacekeepers in the new configuration. So I want the three of you to think about not just West-East, but how East might impact West. Dimitar, I'm going to start with you because I know this has been an issue that you've been thinking about more broadly, but and then maybe we can go in reverse order, Nicole next and Sam. And also, let me remind you, please ask your questions in the Q&A. I see Kim has a question, so we'll get to her right after this.
I mean, it's possible, and it's not without precedent. Remember in Bosnia, where the Saudis and the Iranians, otherwise mortal enemies, would be sending volunteers fighting side by side on behalf of the Bosnian government against the Serb forces. And I mean, UAE has been upping its game in the investment realm. I'm a bit skeptical how much geopolitical leverage that brings and how much influence. When it comes to Islam more generally, that's where Turkey really matters because it sees Salafism and Wahhabism coming from the Gulf as a rival. The Turkish Director of Religious Affairs plays a key role with European Muslims. Not as much in Russia, in Eurasia, but certainly in the EU and in the Western Balkans. So there is some geopolitics behind the surface happening already. Whether that translates into the defense realm, I don't know. That's the honest answer. I'll be curious to, given Nicole's expertise on the Iranian military, what she thinks about this particular issue.
Nicole, same to you. Any prospects of Iran being part of the post-war security architecture in Ukraine?
I think that's unlikely. I mean, Iran has offered to mediate at several points throughout the war, mostly for propaganda purposes. But I mean, I think the Middle East has always impacted the security of Europe. And I actually just was thinking about the ABM treaty. I mean, the reason the US withdrew from the ABM treaty was because of the threat of rogue states like Iran and North Korea. So there's always been this interconnection. And of course, the Iranian missile threat is something that does, it could potentially impact Europe. And that's largely the concern when you hear negotiations on these issues. But I think the Middle East's role in this is really fascinating, especially when we were talking about like grain security and wheat security. I mean, the war was very much affected. I mean, really much affected just like food security in the region. I mean, so there was always this interconnection. A lot of the illicit tanker fleets are actually, usually registered in the UAE. I mean, there's these sanction evasion schemes that actually emerged from the Middle East. A lot of it mirrored Iranian former tactics from the Iranians, but there was always this interconnection. And I think this is much more historic. And for a while, the interaction between the Middle East and the global South has largely been, I guess, neglected until the war in Ukraine, until we saw how globalized this kind of conflict was. And then on top of that is, I think I just saw the US vote. I mean, it makes you question, like, what was the liberal international order and did it ever exist? And was multipolarity, was the advent of multipolarity the war in Ukraine, or has it always been a multipolar environment under the facade of some kind of liberal internationalism that we promoted as a country? But I do think that, you can look at the Iraq War, where the US didn't follow the rules-based international order. You can look at these instances. So, I mean, I don't think that this like axis of upheaval or whatever everyone's calling it these days is actually novel. I think it's been longstanding, and at times the US has also been participant in upending some of the rules that, would be found in the UN Charter.
Yeah, Nicole, thanks for that. That's actually a great analogy, the ABM treaty. That's really super interesting. Sam, same to you.
Yeah, well, definitely, I do think that there's an interrelationship between the Middle Eastern and the European security theaters, and it's been like that really since the start of the war because of the resonance of the war's impact on global issues like food security, as well as the supply chains for various types of rare earth metals and various economic interests. So there always was an economic interlinkage, as well as the fact that Middle Eastern countries seem to be jockeying one after another to kind of present themselves as potential arbiters, contributors to the solution, because they're seeing this as a way to kind of showcase themselves as middle powers that can have global reach beyond just being cash cows and providing investment. So whether it be Oman hosting the dialogues allegedly between the Iranians and the Ukrainians in early 2023 with the discussion about the drones, whether it be Qatar trying to broker the energy security mutual ceasefire which is unraveling because of the Kursk offensive, and Qatar also doing the mediations with regards to the exchange of Russian and Ukrainian children. often in quite a egalitarian way, basically kind of equating, Russia's actual abduction with Ukrainian children with some kind of Russian children who kind of may have fallen across the other side of the line. So kind of equal of making a both sides narrative on an egregious war crime, but still mediating on that. The UAE doing prisoner of war exchanges, Saudi Arabia building on some of their past mediation efforts, which are further in the past, like what they try to do in Sudan, what they did in Eritrea, Ethiopia, turned into a war alliance, but it was something in the context of Ukraine. So we're seeing the big rush for mediation and for status. So what will that mean going forward? I don't really see a scenario, in my view, where there's going to be a lot of Middle Eastern countries becoming security guarantors, really willing to put boots on the ground inside Ukraine. I mean, I don't really see that happening. I mean, I think that Iran has been kind of shell shocked by just the scale of their losses, and the other countries just have a pretty low threshold for military deployments. I mean, Turkey did have an effective military intervention in Libya, but even when it was effective in 2020, opinion surveys showed that only 35% of Turks actually supported it. The Emiratis ran away from Libya as soon as they started suffering some kind of casualties and started moving towards bringing the Janjaweed in from Sudan, the RSF, which then became the RSF. So there's a very low threshold for kind of loss of life, military engagement, direct engagement like that. But definitely we'll see increased involvement in the diplomatic sphere and also increased strategic investments in Ukraine's reconstruction, definitely coming forward, especially as the AI supply chains between Middle Eastern powers and Western supply powers become closer. They will be getting in on some of those rare earth metal developments. Also, because those rare earth metal developments need capital. Trump can talk about a rare earth exchange all he wants, but it can take 18 years to actually get some of those minerals outside the ground. The average cost of a mine construction in a place like Dnipropetrovsk would be about $1 billion to produce. So there needs to be seed capital coming from somewhere. And if it's not necessarily only coming from the United States and the Europeans are focusing on their own defense budgets, these Middle Eastern powers will step in and get involved in that way too.
Thanks all for the answers to those questions. I have a kind of follow-up question to that, but first I want to go to Kim's question in the Q&A and remind people who are watching on the webinar that if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A button at any time to do that, and as well as people who are on YouTube. So Kim Martin asks, do any of the panelists believe that Putin's personal psychology will have any impact on his reactions to the fall of Assad? It's interesting that everyone has stressed Russia's pragmatism, whereas it doesn't fit a lot of what Russia has done in regard to the West and Ukraine. Anyone want to take a gander at this? How Putin himself is reacting to the fall of Assad and whether that's going to have an impact on what we think will be Russia's long-term reaction here? Nicole?
Well, it's not a dramatic reaction because the parallel obviously is the fall of Gaddafi, which is said to have impacted Putin profoundly, seeing the images of Gaddafi being violated and trodden upon and so on and so forth. I don't see anything of sort has happened with Assad. Because for Putin, there's an existential struggle in Ukraine. That's the much bigger fish to fry. So it's hard to put myself in his shoes and speak on his behalf, but I guess that's probably the answer, that he's laser focused on Ukraine and his crusade against the West, and Syria is a sideshow at best, and it's outlived its utility, as has Assad, and he's probably not shedding tear. I mean, for him, Assad is a failure, and he has himself to blame.
Nicole, did you want to?
I was going to bring up Libya. I mean, I think the fall of Gaddafi was the most influential for Putin, just like the images and the brutality of that. But also, I think there's always been an indignation towards Assad on behalf of the Russian leadership. I mean, Putin's never really had a high opinion of Assad. I mean, you can see this in meetings. I mean, Russian officials have even alluded to this. And by many accounts, it does seem that Putin's always viewed Assad as a weak, in a sense, weak, and a lot of the brutality, especially with the chemical weapons use, was a sign of this weakness, or a sign that he wasn't able to control the country. So I think, if anything, it's not so much, he's not viewing Assad through the prism of his own personal survival. I mean, I would be interested to see if they ever give up Assad, if there's ever some kind of agreement with HTS where Russia's like, oh, there's a military tribunal and therefore we're complying with Syrian domestic law, and Assad has been, convicted of these crimes, and therefore we will return him to Syria in exchange for keeping our bases and assets there. So I think that there's a kind of a longer game that Russia may be playing, and especially because he was only given, I think, humanitarian visa status and not citizenship, or wasn't offered asylum completely. So there's this interesting dynamic about what Assad's future is actually in Russia.
Oh, Sam, you want to?
Yeah, just a couple points. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that the Russian antipathy towards Assad was there personally. Yeah, even in as early as 2012, when I was going through and interviewing and discussing stuff from my doctoral research, they were talking about a lot of those things with regards to some of the early massacres, kind of shaping perceptions of his weakness. The other thing that I think that's interesting to keep in mind with regards to Russian positioning on Assad was the fact that, unlike with Yanukovych, for example, in Ukraine, where they kind of clung to this idea that the Yanukovych had been taken out through an extra-legal color revolution, extra-legal coup. Yanukovych was still the legitimate president of Ukraine. There was really no effort from the Russians after the fall of Assad to kind of to make this revolution from HTS like something illegitimate or something illegal. And they really were trying to reach out almost immediately and engage with the new authorities, even if some of the propaganda and the outlets were mumbling in the distance about their obvious connections to terrorism and Al Qaeda and stuff like that. There wasn't that coalescence or kind of attempts to manipulate the legal discourse in Assad's favor that we've seen previously, which is also indicative of the fact that this was probably less rattling for Putin. And I think also the very fact that this happened without any kind of, when Western interference was not happening on the side of the rebels, right? This didn't happen in the period from 2011, 2017, when the West and the Arab countries were pumping huge amounts of money and weapons into the support of the Syrian opposition. This is when the Syrian opposition was effectively getting some clandestine Turkish support, perhaps, but really fighting and developing on their own and fighting as underdogs against the odds. So this was that Western dimension was not there. And I think that he would also view the situation that Assad found himself in, especially in terms of what caused the fall of his regime and what caused the security forces to melt away so quickly, as kind of not something that's necessarily that compatible with with something that could cause a regime threat inside Russia. Because Syria, this was caused obviously by the severe underpayment and lack of compensation of the officer corps, including the Alawite officer corps, who were so disillusioned by the economic crisis and the collapse of the Syrian pound, the collapse of the Lebanese system, that they were willing to take a risk on a Sunni government that they previously viewed as potentially genocidal. And obviously Russia's construction of a war economy, and to the extent possible that they have, I mean, that's debatable, how far they've gone, and some of Russia's efforts to kind of shield and prevent defections and give patronage internally would mean that there isn't really much of a comparison between how the Syrian security forces melted away and how the Russian security forces would defect. Even if I think he was much more rattled, obviously, by the Wagner mutiny and its consequences than the fall of Assad as some kind of an analogy. Every autocrat's fall is a warning to others, but I think that this one was less profound than other things we've seen over the past decade, like Libya, as the others have noted.
Okay, we're getting we're getting some questions coming in about the vote that just took place with the U.S. siding with Russia in the General Assembly, and I do promise we will come to this before the end of the session today. But I want to stick on the middle here for a second. So let me take another question from the Q&A, which keeps the focus a little bit more on the Middle East, but links it back to Ukraine, which is from Maria Chuknaba, who is saying, should we expect increased destabilization and inter-country violence in the Middle East if Russia ends up getting a very favorable settlement vis-a-vis Ukraine? What would be the implications? And I think this kind of follows nicely from some of the introductory remarks, especially Sam's remarks, and actually things all of you have said about Syria being not the key element here because Russia is so focused on Ukraine. But if Russia becomes less focused on Ukraine, what does that mean for the Middle East? And I want to also bracket that with a question that I had, which kind of comes at this from a different angle, which is that one of the things I'm wondering is, we're hearing about all these different potentially foreign policy shifts due to the new administration in the United States. And today we've been focusing on, this question is on the implication of what happens in the U.S. foreign policy shift around Ukraine for the Middle East. But I was wondering as well, one of the other things we hear when the focus is on the Middle East, as opposed to the focus being on Russia and Ukraine, is the possibility of coming back to the Abraham Accords, this kind of more grand coalition where you end up getting an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and even potentially getting an agreement that involves Saudi Arabia, this may be more fanciful, Iran and Israel. What does that do for Russia in the Middle East, right? A couple of you, and Sam, you had mentioned how Russia has sort of staked a bit of its soft power now, or one of the things that's helping with its soft power is its position vis-a-vis Israel in terms of the Palestinian conflict going on right now. But what happens if you actually end up seeing something where Saudi comes closer to Israel? What does that do to Russia in the Middle East? So again, going back with this theme that we've been going on here about the links between what's happening in the Middle East with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and feel free to jump into this from either direction. I don't know, Sam, do you want to take first shot at that?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting set of questions and comments here. Yeah, look, going back to Maria's first one, I think pivoting over to yours. Yeah, should expect an increase in destabilization if Russia gets a good settlement in Ukraine? I think we need to draw a distinction between Russia capitalizing on instability where it sees it and Russia being the instigator of instability, because I feel like all too often those two things get blurred together. I think that was especially the case when we were looking at the coups in Mali, Burkina, and Niger. There were lots of reports that Russia triggered those coups because some people in Nazim Goita's circle were trained in Moscow, or because there were some civil society groups like M62 in Niger that were protesting against France and holding Russian flags. But the reality was it was Russia kind of capitalizing on disdain and frustration with the French involvement and the perceived inefficacy and latent conspiracies and issues with regards to the allegations that the French were kind of extracting uranium and gold from these countries and taking 95% of it and trickling it down and enabling corruption. Those things were not new to even Russian propaganda. Those are the narratives that were spreading even from the Tuareg rebels in Mali from 2012. So, I mean, you got to just kind of look back at these things a little bit more critically. I think that Russia is much more of a country that needs to be opportunistic and nimble and capitalizes on instability because unlike China, unlike most other countries, is unafraid of but unabashedly endorsing coup regimes and regimes that take power extra legally in that front, even though it chafes at popular revolutions and democratic revolutions elsewhere in the world. That's a double standard, but they tend to capitalize on that. And so in the Middle East going forward, I mean, I think that they will be they will still be risk averse, they'll still be cautious, they will take advantage of opportunities to destabilize, but not go so far. They worked with the Houthis, but when Mohammed bin Salman made it very clear that giving anti-ship missiles to them would potentially create problems in the Russia-Saudi relationship, the Russians pulled back for the most part. Even with the Russian support for Libya, I mean, there's a lot of commentaries I've seen and interviews I've done that to suggest that they view Haftar with a lot of skepticism, and also they view the fact that the Turks have acquiesced to him, the Emiratis are backing him clandestinely and diplomatically, and the Russians have a foothold there. He's relatively stable, but they're not going to encourage him at this moment in time to necessarily make another assault on Tripoli or overtly violate the UN Charter. It's better to kind of make him focus on recognizing the authority over the areas that he has. So my point of view is that the Russians are going to tolerate separatist actors, non-state actors that might have destabilizing intentions, but not necessarily exacerbate or instigate that destabilization. They might just capitalize on it. Very briefly, with regards to the Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran question, which is really interesting, Josh. I would say that Israel and Saudi rapprochement, obviously, everything depends on what happens in terms of the settlement in Gaza. I mean, I think that some kind of a settlement which does not lead to some kind of Palestinian self-determination in Gaza, whether it be the reinstatement of the Palestinian Authority or some kind of other extra systemic figure, not saying Dalan, but somebody of that ilk kind of coming in, would be very hard for the Saudis to normalize with Israel at this time. Also, if the Israelis continue their attacks on the Golan Heights, that would and into Syria and pushes demilitarization of Syria further from whatever they're going to do with that, it gets harder. But if there is a settlement in Gaza that eventually leads to a transition towards some degree of Palestinian self-determination there, and the Israeli-Syrian relationship cools off, certainly HTS looks like they want to cool it off, according to some of their rhetoric. I think that it's possible that the Israelis and the Saudis could normalize going forward. Iran and the Saudi track and the Israeli-Saudi track, I think, would be entirely separate, but the possibility is that Saudi Arabia could have good relations with both Israel and Iran. And that's not so good for Russia because I think that Russia has historically tried to thrive on being kind of like, a player that can talk to all the countries, being kind of an elder statesman in the room. And when other countries were seen to be taking sides, they were kind of standing back. So I think that Russia thrives on these kind of low intensity conflicts and intense rivalries in the region. So the congealing of the region is not something that necessarily favors its interests either.
Great. I'm going to weigh in here and pick up a question asked by Lucas Brooks, and he asks, is the concept of trustworthiness significant in geopolitical decision making? If so, how do Trump's reversals impact the long-term appeal of the U.S. versus Russia as a partner for third parties? And Nicole, I want to go to you with this in asking, and then maybe Dimitar, how do you see kind of reputation and credibility and trust playing into Russia's Middle East outreach? Certainly, the Arab Spring is always pointed to as an occasion where, the U.S. just tossed its longtime allies under the bus, under pressure of sort of street protests and sort of democracy and this kind of thing. But is there just such deep, wide cynicism that trust doesn't really matter, right? Does anyone have any trust in Moscow? So I'd be curious from your perspective, either on the Iranian or the Syrian front, and then we'll go to Dimitar.
On the Iranian side, I mean, there's always been this tendency to say that Russia's not very trustworthy, that Russia has betrayed them in the past, and this is very constant in the Iranian domestic discourse. I think reputationally, Russia in the Middle East more broadly, it's often been actually quite adept at outreach to certain countries. I mean, to the countries that are not dependent on Russia for its survival. So Russian diplomats, especially those in the Middle East department, they're quite effective in a lot of their dealings. They don't, emphasize human rights. They don't emphasize the kind of things that these countries are much more averse to. But I mean, I think the comparison between Trump and Putin is somewhat, it's somewhat difficult to really make, because they're just fundamentally different type of actors. I mean, I think Russia in the Middle East has been actually much more consistent in terms of its policies than actually the US has been within the last 24 hours, for example. So, but I mean, I do think that the Russians, and in many ways, the Russians have a reputation when it comes to arms sales as well. I mean, Russia has been a reliable supplier of arms to some of these countries that, perhaps might be more restrained on certain markets. And then at the same time, they've also been slow to deliver certain weapons and equipment. And I think Iran is a very good example of that. What is interesting is to see is if there is an escalation between Iran and Israel, how far Russia is willing to support Iran, either through more air defenses and radars, or actually intelligence and intelligence sharing there. And so that would be, I think, a pretty big indication of whether or not the Iranians can actually trust the Russians.
Great. Dimitar.
Well, Turkey has a trust issue, but not with Russia, but with the United States. And that's been the case for a long, long time. I mean, think about it. It's a NATO ally. The US nuclear guarantee extends to Turkey. There are even nuclear weapons deployed in Turkey, in the Incirlik base. And for all that, across many administrations, you have tensions. And this is the first Gulf War, really, when northern Iraq and the no-fly zone opened the opportunity for PKK to deploy. And then into Syria, all the way when Obama didn't enforce his red lines, which was a strong signal to the Turkish leadership. I think the calculus in Turkey has always been that if there is a clash with Russia, Turkey will be left alone to face a very aggressive neighbor, and the US won't be there. It's very much the predicament Europeans find themselves right now. And the Turkish response was to embrace Russia, to soft balance it, to cooperate, but also to make sure that they have enough cards in their sleeve to play against the Russians. So that's the thing. When it comes to the Russians, the expectations are not very high. And there is a working relationship, partly because of the nature of the two regimes, that two strong men are at the top. And they built a personal tie, and they can talk to one another. They can deal blows, but also come back to the table and negotiate almost in mafioso style when their interests overlap. So there's not, if you poll the Turks, they distrust the Russians as much as they distrust the Americans. But this idea that there's a personal dimension is some sort of a countervailing force. But again, the big thrust figures with the US, really, not with the Russians.
All right. We're gonna go to Ukraine in a minute, but I want to ask one more question while we have our experts on Russia and the Middle East. In a sort of maybe a little rapid fire round here, where do you see Russia's relationship with the Syrian regime in 3 to 5 years? I mean, I know there's a lot of moving pieces, and I know that this is contingent on a lot of different things. But do we have a sense that that Russia's relationship with Syria, I mean, on the one hand, you can imagine a situation where it's irrevocably fractured because of all the support for Assad and how much of, this coming regime is going to be reckoning with the Assad period in Syria. On the other hand, there seems to be so much going on the ground here and so many different moving pieces here that one can imagine, as we've said, these deals for where the bases stay, Russia becomes just one of another, a pragmatic attempt by, to balance different powers and stuff like that. If I had to put you on the spot here and sort of ask about going out, seeing out in the medium term, I'm not trying to get into what's going to happen in the next, in the next things, but in the medium term, is Russia still involved with Syria? Is there, Nicole, you had this provocative thing where they could trade, I think it was Nicole, you said, where they could trade back Assad back, or maybe that was, I forget who said that point, but where on this spectrum do we think Russia's relationship with Syria is 3 to 5 years out? Nicole?
I mean, I think it would be a very big strategic loss if they did give up Tartus, just because they do need that for expeditionary operations elsewhere in Africa or North Africa. I mean, that's a hard question, and it's obviously contingent on quite a bit of factors. I mean, I think it is foreseeable that Russia will do its best to have some kind of arrangement with HTS. They do have leverage when it comes to the UN and also the designation of HTS as a terrorist organization. So that's one area that the Russians can also use influence. And then also, I mean, Syria was reliant on Russia for a lot of goods and services. And so if the Russians can, by some miracle, come back and try at least to have some kind of at least influence in a certain area, primarily the Alawite heartlands, I think that's possible. But it's also possible that Syria devolves into more chaos, and that would be incredibly unfortunate. But it's also a possibility, and you could also foreseeably see Russia exploiting that alongside the typical actors like Iran. It's hard to know for sure, but if I were a decision maker in Russia, I would try my best to keep the assets that I have, especially Tartus, because of its strategic value.
Right, and I can definitely see it from the point of view of Russia's perspective here. I mean, in a weird way, it's the analogy is, I mean, and obviously there's a lot of reasons it's quite different, but imagining the Americans having, relationships with Khomeini, 2 or 3 years after the collapse of the Shah, right? The U.S. backing of the Shah and the fall of the Shah pushed back, U.S.-Iranian relations for decades at this point. And here that we're talking about, after all the support that Russia gave to Assad and all of the support it gave in particularly putting down insurgencies against Assad, that we're kind of in this world. Dimitar, did you have a comment on that?
Well, authoritarian regimes have this quality of being very nimble. So Russia can effect a U-turn just because the boss decides so. And the narrative changes top down. In a democratic system as the US, the conflict is embedded in various institutions. So I think there won't be a problem for the Russians. But I want just to echo what Nicole said, the two scenarios. And they're very much contingent on what happens in Syria itself, with al-Sharaa being able to put this thing together and probably reestablish some sort of authoritarian or soft authoritarian regime in the image of Turkey or what have you, integrating the various bits, which is not obvious. I mean, they don't have the manpower. There's a great FT article today looking at some of those dynamics. We have the Northeast, we have the South with its own leadership as well. How do you bring all those together is a big issue. In case al-Sharaa manages to do that, maybe he'll be motor vectoring and he'll need the Russians, and he might even reach back to the Iranians just to minimize his dependence on the Gulf. So that will be al-Sisi in a way. So Russia will be needed. But there might be a chaos scenario, not unlike Libya, where Russia decides to play the spoiler, which is a role they are very much adapted at playing. Sponsor various Assad loyalists, Alawite, even the SDF, the Kurdish forces, and try to be Machiavellian, talk to Damascus, but at the same time leverage totalitarianistic policy through those breakaway regions and militias, investing into chaos. We've seen it elsewhere. I don't see why Syria, unfortunately, won't devolve into something along those lines.
Yeah,
Sam?
just one very brief comment. Yeah, I think I agree with everybody that Russia's going to be quite pragmatic and quite nimble here. I think that also it depends on how the Russians and the Syrian governments kind of communicate with each other. I think it was quite interesting that Ahmed al-Shara, like I think in one of his interviews right before the new year, he was talking about how Russia is the second most powerful country in the world. So that kind of rhetoric of a status and prestige and dershavnost really kind of appeals to the Russians. And I think al-Shara is a consummate, figure who's pretty good at, selling different narratives to different people, and that means I think that over time the Russians will admire working with the new Syrian authorities. If the Syrians frame it as them kind of standing up to the West or them having a multipolar policy, they're having freedom of choice. I noticed that Russian Telegram channels and Russian uh, media outlets, as well as some Iran Hezbollah aligned media outlets, were quite irate about this statement that came from the Dutch, saying that we won't lift sanctions on Syria and its development unless the Russians commit to a full scale withdrawal from the country. And the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah were framing that as some kind of a violation of Syrian sovereignty and the Syrian right to or any country's right to having a freedom of choice to choose which power you want to align with, and then sticks being used on that. So there is a scope, I think, in their messaging to kind of come together. And there's a few precedents also I think we should keep in mind from other parts of the region. Fadi Bashaga in Libya, I think, is one interesting example. When he was at the Sochi summit in 2019, Yevgeny Prigozhin's Riafan and other outlets were on a complete propaganda attack on him. They were basically talking about his Turkish ancestry, linking him to Turkish-aligned al-Qaeda groups in Syria, claiming he was a terrorist. Less than 3 years later, in early 2022, the Russians were actually the first of the UNP5 to lead Hadi Bashaga's takeover as prime minister in terms of backing him. And they got frustrated with him again when Hadi Bashaga and his cabinet condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's lots of that's one example of just how nimble and how effective the Russians can be in terms of taking a former terrorist and then suddenly rehabilitating him and then going back and forth on him. And there's so many other things too that go just beyond uh, the basis. I mean, there's also agricultural supply and wheat. There's oil. There's other interests that the Russians are going to be eyeing in the reconstruction. The Russians had a leg up potentially in the battle for phosphates and in the chemical industry before Assad's fall. Their Russian companies, if they're alleviated of sanctions, will want to get in there, so they'll keep a roll.
All right, so let's get your thoughts and reactions about what is happening now at the UN. And we'll, if you want to link it to the Middle East, great. If you just want to give your analysis, because you're all very knowledgeable observers of the Ukraine conflict, or maybe how this is even going to be perceived by other regional actors, you could take that angle. Let's do that to close out. So give each of you a couple of minutes, and then why don't we go in reverse order? Let's start with Dimitar, then go to Nicole, then with Stephen. So Dimitar, what are your reactions to today's news?
Well, we are overwhelmed by news. There is always a new announcement on something, and I mean, I'm a bit skeptical what will come out of this rapprochement between US and Russia. We've been there before, and my bottom line is Helsinki 2018, when expectations run high and didn't amount to anything. There'll be probably some normalization in the bilateral track with negotiations on resuming diplomatic contacts with maybe the new start, which will be welcome, just to put a good spin to what's happening. I'm skeptical about the American businesses going back to Russia. Our colleague Maria Snegavaya actually had a good piece on this, that so long as the West, i.e. European Union, holds the Russian reserves, Russia will be tempted to effect a tit for tat for any Western companies that are still in Russia. So there is no security, no rules by which any investor will be shielded. So full economic normalization is probably a long goal at best. Implications for the Middle East, going back to the question about what happens if Putin takes Ukraine. Well, in this scenario, Ukraine is a big place, right? It won't self-police. You need Russia to be there. And so the bogging down scenario we talked about at the beginning of the conflict still applies. There won't be any bandwidth for Russia to say, okay, Ukraine is done and let's focus elsewhere in the world and go back to the Middle East. I don't think that will happen. But having said that, I don't think taking over the entirety of Ukraine is still in the cards. I mean, Pokrovsk is still Ukrainian, and the Donetsk Oblast is not taken by Russia in its completeness. So yeah, we're not there anywhere, and Russia will be focused on Ukraine for the time being in the post-Soviet space.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Same to you. Initial reactions.
I mean, the recent UN vote is one of the most interesting coalitions of votes I've seen before. I mean, I was just looking at it. I mean, like Russia's traditional partners, I mean, like Iran, for example, abstained on it. And typically Israel would abstain on these resolutions, but they voted for it partly because of the United States, I assume. It's really interesting how that's kind of evolving. I mean, I agree with Dimitar. Like the prospects of a total U.S. Russia rapprochement is, I mean, that's difficult. Even the arms, strategic arms control or strategic stability talks, we don't really have a foundation for that. New Start's going to be very difficult because you can't renew New Start. You have to renegotiate an entirely new treaty. And so one of the traditional pathways for rapprochement, which has been arms control, that's difficult. I mean, in the Middle East, the US and the Russians, maybe you'll see some movement on the Iran nuclear file, though I highly doubt it because the Russians have been so outside of any kind of aid or support for actually curbing Iran's nuclear ambitions. I think that the kind of realignment right now maybe just be reflective of the current Trump administration and their outlook, less so than a clear like pathway towards this U.S.-Russia improved ties. But it's interesting, and I think, I guess the next few months or even weeks, we'll see like if this is actually going to come to fruition. But for now, it just seems like an anomaly in terms of like UN voting and UN patterns. And if it was the Russians who, the Russians typically, whenever they vote at the UN, actually have like a legal reason for doing something. They'll refer to some point of the UN Charter which doesn't align with their views on sovereignty or something. I think the US position was just that it mentioned that Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was why they voted against it, if I'm correct. But so that doesn't really seem like it was, thought out like legalistically, which I think the Russians probably have their own long legal explanation for that. But we'll see. I mean, it's very interesting, I guess.
Thanks, Nicole. Sam, let's go to you for the last word here.
Yeah, like one of the interesting things about all of this is that, in the lead up to the 2022 invasion was that Russia was working so hard to try to polarize the West and the global South in terms of two parallel different understandings of international affairs. And they managed to get a lot of global South, if not solidarity, certainly the global South not isolating them after the annexation of Crimea, or after the conduct in Georgia, and then again in 2022. But with the United States and Europe now having this kind of falling out, and the U.S. kind of now pushing for kind of this notion of peace kind of being the dominant theme inside Ukraine or an end to the war, which is kind of similar to some of the humanitarian peace resolutions that the Mexicans tried to push. I think early on in 2022, it's a blurring of that division. I think it's in some ways quite a significant victory for Russia from an information standpoint. Also, I think it's just remarkable, when you look at these votes, and I think we should see this is just one vote, but it does this pattern continue. It was remarkable how polarized, how entrenched the number of states that would vote to condemn the war and the number of states that would vote to support Russia were in the early stages of the conflict. I think it was 140 and 141. In the MENA region, the only swing actor happened to be Iraq. And that was largely a calculus about weak deliveries and also some of the internecine debates between the Sadrists and the Iran and the PMF about exactly how to approach the war, impacting their vote. But the thing was very static, right? And the countries that supported Russia were always Eritrea, Belarus, the co-aggressor, North Korea, the future co-aggressor, and even Venezuela didn't vote because they didn't pay their fees. But like the thing is, yeah. So in general, it was so static and so divided. Those divisions showed up in the UN Human Rights Council vote and also in the Zelensky formula, Jeddah meeting in less pronounced ways, but still a clear West global South divide. It's pretty interesting to see if some of those divisions start melting away or shifting in the votes that follow, because we're seeing a lessening of the polarizations in the international system and potentially Russia moving from a strategy of pitting the global South and the West against each other and treating abstentions as victories to actually getting a maybe more of a full escape from international isolation.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to know. I mean, when we talk about personality and how people respond to things, it's interesting to note how many other countries, though, I mean, we can go to this abstain as victory, but how many few countries joined the United States. I mean, it's an interesting, I was like Nicole, I was quickly trying to like look at the list, like Hades on it and Niger, so there's a couple of places there. But yeah, no, I think there's an interesting piece in the Economist this week as well about one of the leaders in the Economist is about how China has been actually trying to bring about more and more of a commitment among countries in the global south to adopt its language around Taiwan and how the Taiwan situation should be resolved. So there's parallels here in kind of both of these territorial aspiration type situations. All right. Well, with that, I guess it was inevitable that we were going to get interrupted by some big news event, as Dimitar put, and given that we were on the air for 90 minutes here. But I want to, on behalf of Alex and myself and the Jordan Center and the Harriman Institute and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, I want to thank all three of our panelists today for an incredibly enlightening discussion. This was super valuable, and I, the knowledge that you guys can bring to this discussion is incredibly impressive. Keep doing it. Keep getting out there. Make sure that we need to have high quality level analysis in the public discussion, especially when things are happening so sort of fast and furious in this regard. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. To those of you on YouTube, thanks for joining as well. Those of you who are watching this on the video, our next meeting of the New York City Russia Public Policy seminar will be on March 31st, similar around lunchtime. And the planned theme for that one is the conflict in Ukraine. So ostensibly, there will be lots to discuss at that point. A month out from now, who knows how many changes there will be, but we'll be bringing people together and we'll have a great lineup for you then. So I hope that you can join us then. And again, once again, thanks to everybody for participating today. Thanks for Carnegie for your support, and thanks to our panelists. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.